The thing about empires that span galaxies is that they develop opinions. Not carefully researched, peer-reviewed, scientifically vetted opinions, mind you. More like the kind of sweeping generalizations your uncle makes at dinner after 3 drinks. The Galactic Collective had been around for approximately 14,000 standard cycles, which was plenty of time to get comfortable with being wrong about a great many things while remaining absolutely certain they were right. Take physical combat, for instance. The Collective had moved past such barbarism, obviously. They were civilized, enlightened. They settled disputes through diplomatic channels and arbitration committees and strongly worded memos that took 6 months to compose. But they also maintained the Helix Combat Academy, because when you've got 300 member species scattered across 47 sectors, sometimes someone needs to know how to throw a punch. For diplomatic reasons, security purposes, preserving cultural heritage. The official documentation was very specific about this not being contradictory at all. Station Helix 9 orbited a neutron star in the Kragoth system, which was either poetic or deeply ironic, depending on your perspective. The station itself was a marvel of engineering. A rotating torus 3 kilometers in diameter that generated its own gravity through spin. Inside, species from across known space learned the ancient and noble art of beating the living daylights out of each other in controlled environments. The Academy had been established roughly 4,000 cycles ago, after the Vrexian-Kolthari border dispute had escalated into what historians politely termed an unfortunate exchange of kinetic diplomacy. The Vrexians had won that particular exchange, which surprised absolutely no one. They were built like organic tanks, stood anywhere from 7 to 9 feet tall depending on subspecies, and possessed a skeletal structure that could probably survive atmospheric re-entry. Their homeworld pulled about 2.3 times standard gravity, and their evolutionary ancestors had apparently spent their formative millennia fighting everything on their planet that wanted to eat them. Which, according to xenobiological surveys, was everything on their planet, including the plants. The Vrexians had looked at a universe full of softer, squishier species and concluded they were the apex predators of the galaxy. For 4,000 cycles, they had been essentially correct. The Academy's training rotations lasted 1 standard year, during which recruits from various species learned combat techniques, tactical thinking, and how to not accidentally kill someone from a species with fragile skeletal structures during what was supposed to be a friendly sparring match. The curriculum was remarkably comprehensive. It had to be. When you're teaching a species that breathes methane how to fight alongside someone who considers methane a toxic poison, you need very detailed safety protocols. Humans had been members of the Galactic Collective for approximately 70 cycles. They'd been members of the Helix Combat Academy for exactly 0 cycles until 6 months ago, when the Collective finally approved their application. The approval process had taken 12 cycles, which was relatively fast by bureaucratic standards and glacially slow by human standards. The delay hadn't been about politics or prejudice. It was about biology. Humans, by galactic standards, were adorably fragile. Their homeworld pulled a perfectly average 1 standard gravity. They had no natural armor, no redundant organs worth mentioning, no regenerative capabilities that would impress anyone, and bones that seemed designed to break if you looked at them wrong. Their muscle density was laughable. Their reaction times were mediocre. Their sensory capabilities were so limited that other species genuinely felt bad bringing it up. Humans couldn't see in infrared or ultraviolet. They couldn't echolocate. Their sense of smell was so poor they'd apparently domesticated animals just to smell things for them. The Collective's medical board had spent 8 cycles debating whether allowing humans into combat training constituted a safety violation. The humans had spent those 8 cycles insisting they were perfectly capable, thank you very much, and providing extensive documentation about their own martial traditions. The board had reviewed this documentation with the kind of polite skepticism usually reserved for children's crayon drawings. Wrestling, boxing, various forms of combat from different regions, with names the board's translation matrix struggled to process accurately. It all looked very enthusiastic and extremely dangerous to the participants. Eventually, the collective had approved one human candidate on a trial basis, partially because the humans had been remarkably persistent in their applications, mostly because the Vrexian combat master in charge of the Academy's advanced program had personally vouched that he could handle one fragile little primate without breaking it too badly. His name was Krovax Thunvorath, and he was exactly the kind of instructor who made that kind of statement. He'd been teaching at Helix for 60 cycles, had personally trained 3 generations of Vrexian elite warriors, and maintained a perfect record of producing the highest-scoring graduates in the Academy's history. He was 8 feet 4 inches of solid muscle and reinforced bone, with a jaw that could crush titanium and a sense of humor that could best be described as deliberately absent. The human who arrived at Station Helix 9 on the transport from Earth's orbital station stood 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed approximately 62 kilograms. She had dark hair pulled back in what humans called a ponytail, brown eyes that tracked movement with unnerving focus, and an expression of polite neutrality that gave away absolutely nothing. Her name was Elena Koskinen, though most of the Academy would never bother learning it. She was 28 standard years old, had served in something called the Finnish Defense Forces, and her application file contained a list of qualifications that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent time studying human cultural contexts. Krovax had reviewed her file for approximately 45 seconds before tossing it aside. The human female was cleared for standard training rotation. She'd be assigned to his advanced combat cohort because the other instructors had insisted they weren't qualified to teach human-specific techniques, which was bureaucratic speak for, "We don't want to be responsible when this goes badly." Fine. Krovax had trained Kolthari, whose bodies were made of crystalline silicon. He'd trained Mythaxians who existed partially in non-Euclidean space. He could certainly handle one unremarkably average human, who'd probably break down crying during the first endurance drill. The advanced combat cohort consisted of 17 members representing 9 species. There were 3 Vrexians, because of course there were. 2 Kolthari, whose rocky exteriors made them excellent at defensive techniques. 4 Zenthari, insectoid species with compound eyes and reaction times that made them exceptional strikers. 3 Drashkin, amphibious beings whose flexibility was genuinely unsettling to watch. 2 Quorim, cybernetically enhanced species who'd replaced roughly 40% of their original biology with military-grade hardware. 1 Thessian, a crystalline species that communicated through light pulses and could reorganize its molecular structure at will. 1 Vaxor, a species that resembled what humans might call a really angry bear if the bear was 9 feet tall and had 6 arms. And 1 human. Elena's arrival in the training complex had been met with the kind of silence that suggested everyone had already formed their opinions. The Vrexians had glanced at her with dismissive amusement. The Zenthari had clicked their mandibles in what their species considered laughter. The Kolthari had said nothing, because they rarely said anything. But the vibrations in their rocky surfaces suggested skepticism. The human had simply bowed slightly at the neck, said something that translated as a polite greeting, and taken her position in the formation. Krovax had examined her the way someone might examine a particularly disappointing meal. "So, you are the human." Yes, instructor. Her voice came through the translation matrix, calm and level. You understand that this is advanced combat training, not a cultural exchange program, not a diplomatic exercise. We will be engaging in full contact sparring with minimal protective gear. I understand, instructor. You understand that your species' physical limitations will not earn you special consideration here. I wouldn't expect any, instructor. Krovax's jaw had twitched in what might have been annoyance or amusement. Good. Then let us see what Earth's finest has to offer. The first week had been assessment drills, basic conditioning, strength evaluation, speed trials, endurance testing. Elena had performed exactly as expected based on her species' biological baseline. She could run at speeds that were adequate. She could lift weights that were unimpressive. Her endurance was reasonable for a creature that breathed oxygen and processed energy through embarrassingly inefficient biological mechanisms. The other cohort members had watched with varying degrees of pity and second-hand embarrassment. The Vrexians had been less subtle. Does it always breathe that hard? One had asked after a basic sprint drill. Maybe it is broken, another had suggested with what passed for Vrexian humor. Elena had said nothing, simply returned to position and waited for the next drill. Krovax had watched all this with growing vindication. This was exactly what he'd expected. The human was trying. He'd give her that much credit. She showed up on time, followed instructions, didn't complain about the difficulty. But trying wasn't the same as succeeding, and success in combat required physical capabilities that her species simply didn't possess. This was going to be a very long rotation, and at the end of it, he'd file a report recommending that humans stick to diplomatic corps positions where their fragility wouldn't be a liability. The second week introduced actual combat techniques, basic striking forms, defensive positions, movement patterns. This was where the serious training began, and this was where the gap between species became impossible to ignore. The Vrexians moved with brutal efficiency, their strikes generating kinetic force that would liquefy most organic beings. The Zenthari were lightning fast, their multiple limbs creating attack patterns that were nearly impossible to defend against. Even the Drashkin, with their seemingly awkward body structure, could contort into positions that made them incredibly difficult targets. Elena learned the forms. She practiced the movements. She absorbed the instruction with what seemed like genuine focus. But when it came time to execute against actual opponents, the differences were stark. Her strikes lacked penetrating force. Her defensive positions couldn't withstand serious impact. Her movement speed was just barely adequate to avoid getting demolished completely. Krovax had watched her get knocked down 17 times during one sparring session. She'd gotten up 16 times. The 17th time, the medical team had insisted on a 5-minute break to check for concussion. The human had protested that she was fine. The medical scanner had disagreed. Krovax had used the break to address the cohort. This is why we have species-specific limitations in combat protocols, he'd said, gesturing at Elena with one massive hand. Some beings are simply not built for this level of engagement. There is no shame in accepting biological reality. The human had looked at him with those unsettlingly focused brown eyes and said nothing. The third week was when Krovax started making it personal. He told himself it was instructional. He was demonstrating important principles about knowing one's limitations, about understanding when honor required strategic retreat rather than stubborn persistence, about accepting that some paths weren't meant for certain species. He'd begun calling on Elena specifically for demonstration purposes. Let us show the cohort proper defensive stance, he'd announce, then proceed to strike through her guard with casual ease, sending her sprawling. Notice how inadequate skeletal structure fails under pressure. Or, watch as I demonstrate the inefficiency of low muscle density strikes, before allowing her to hit his torso with full force, producing approximately zero effect while he stood there looking bored. Or, observe the limited durability of human bone structure, before applying a joint lock that forced her to tap out or suffer actual injury. The rest of the cohort had taken their cues from their instructor. The Vrexians openly mocked her technique. The Zenthari made clicking sounds whenever she entered the training floor. Even the normally stoic Kolthari had begun making grinding noises that their species considered derisive humor. The human had become the cohort's collective joke, the walking example of what happened when a species overestimated its own capabilities. Elena had endured all of it with the same neutral expression. She took the falls. She accepted the corrections. She showed up every single day and went through the drills with mechanical precision. Krovax had privately admitted to another instructor that he'd expected her to quit by now. Most recruits broke down when they realized they were fundamentally outclassed. The human just kept coming back. It was, in its own way, almost admirable, also deeply frustrating. The point of this trial period was to demonstrate that humans weren't suitable for combat training, and she was refusing to cooperate by actually giving up. The breaking point came during week 4, in the middle of what should have been a routine sparring exercise. Krovax had been demonstrating proper striking technique to a Zenthari recruit who'd been having trouble generating sufficient force on the follow-through. He'd decided to use the human as a practice target. After all, she was durable enough to survive a few demonstration strikes, and it would reinforce the lesson about species-appropriate force application. "You," he'd called, gesturing at Elena. "Take defensive position." She'd complied without hesitation, settling into the stance he'd taught them. The key to devastating strikes, Krovax had told the observing cohort, is commitment. Half strength accomplishes nothing. You must strike with full conviction. He'd turned to Elena. "Maintain your guard, human." The first strike had been measured, controlled, a moderate force blow that had tested her defensive position. She'd absorbed it. Stance, wobbling but holding. "Inadequate," Krovax had announced. Again. The second strike had been harder. She'd taken it, stepped back, reset. Still weak, again. The third strike had actually broken through her guard, caught her shoulder, sent her stumbling back 3 steps. The cohort had stirred with interest. This was better entertainment than most drills. "Pathetic," Krovax had said, and there was heat in his voice now. 4 weeks of watching this fragile creature stubbornly refuse to acknowledge reality had worn through his professional detachment. This is what happens when species ignore biological limitations. You cannot guard what you lack the structure to protect. You cannot strike what you lack the strength to damage. You are a liability in any genuine combat scenario, and your presence here endangers everyone who might eventually serve alongside you. Elena had straightened, breathing hard but meeting his eyes. "Again, instructor." Something in Krovax had snapped. The audacity of this soft, weak, inadequate creature demanding more. The presumption that effort could overcome fundamental physical reality. The sheer human arrogance of thinking they belonged in the same training hall as actual warriors. "You want again?" His voice had carried across the training floor. "Very well. Let me show you exactly how outmatched you are." What happened next would be reviewed by station security 17 times. The official report would describe it in dry, clinical language that completely failed to capture the actual event. Krovax had moved with full Vrexian combat speed, a blur of muscle and reinforced bone, leading with a strike that was well beyond training intensity. It was the kind of hit designed to end fights, to demonstrate absolute dominance, to put an opponent down so decisively that they'd never get back up. It never landed. Elena had moved, not quickly by Zenthari standards, not with the flowing grace of Drashkan flexibility, just moved, a slight rotation of her torso, a minimal shift of position that put her exactly where the strike wasn't. And before Kovacs's momentum could carry him past, before his combat instincts could trigger a secondary response, before his brain could fully process what was happening, the human had pivoted on her back foot and thrown everything she had into a single punch. Her fist caught him square in the jaw with a sound like a gunshot. The thing about Phyrexian bone structure was that it was incredibly dense, reinforced with mineral deposits, designed to withstand tremendous impact. It was, in nearly every measurable way, superior to the delicate calcium-based skeleton that humans dragged around inside their fragile bodies. Nearly every measurable way. What the xenobiological surveys had failed to mention, because humans hadn't volunteered the information and no one had thought to ask, was that human bones weren't just calcium. They were composite structures, calcium matrix reinforced with collagen fibers, designed by evolution to be flexible under stress. Human knuckles, when properly conditioned, could survive impact forces that would shatter more rigid skeletal structures. Human bone could bend before breaking, could distribute force across multiple joints, could channel kinetic energy through a lever system that multiplied force far beyond what raw muscle strength suggested. Elena's punch had generated approximately 800 pounds of force at impact. This was not exceptional by galactic standards. The Phyrexians regularly trained with strikes that exceeded 2,000 pounds of force. But force was only half the equation. The other half was focus. Human martial arts had spent thousands of years refining the principle of channeling maximum force through minimum surface area. The punch that caught Kovacs's jaw didn't just hit hard. It hit precisely at exactly the angle where his jaw structure was most vulnerable, with a rotation that multiplied the torque. In the split-second window where his own forward momentum added to the impact force, the mathematical result was a localized pressure that exceeded the fracture threshold of Phyrexian bone. Kovacs's jaw had shattered in 3 places. The training floor had gone absolutely silent. The kind of silence that occurs when something theoretically impossible has just visibly occurred. 17 cohort members and 4 assistant instructors had stood frozen, watching their supposedly invincible combat master stagger backward, one hand clutching his ruined jaw, bioluminescent blood leaking between his fingers. Elena had simply stood there, her right hand already swelling from the impact, her expression still neutral, waiting to see if he was going to get back up. He didn't. The medical team had arrived within 90 seconds, because the station's medical AI had detected Kovacs's distress signals and dispatched emergency response automatically. They'd stabilized his jaw, sedated him for transport, and evacuated him to the medical bay within 4 minutes. The cohort had remained frozen on the training floor, struggling to process what they'd witnessed. One of the assistant instructors, a Zenthari named Six Tick, had finally approached Elena. "How did you do that?" The human had looked at her damaged hand, flexing fingers experimentally. He left himself open. "That is not an answer." "Yeah," Elena had said quietly. "I know." The investigation had been swift and surprisingly anticlimactic. Station security reviewed the training floor footage from 14 different angles. The consensus was unanimous. Kovacs had initiated an attack with excessive force outside approved training protocols, and Elena had responded with an appropriate defensive counter. That the counter had caused catastrophic injury to a supposedly superior species was noted but not considered relevant to questions of fault. Kovacs's jaw had required extensive reconstructive surgery. The medical report estimated 8 to 10 weeks for full recovery, followed by physical therapy to restore normal function. His teaching duties were suspended indefinitely. The Helix Academy administration sent a formal apology to Elena for the unsafe training environment. She'd declined to file any official complaint. The real fallout had been quieter and far more widespread. The footage of a 62-kilogram human shattering a Vrexian combat master's jaw with a single punch had propagated through unofficial channels across the entire station within 6 hours. Within 3 days, it had reached every collective military installation in the sector. Within a week, xenobiological research teams were scrambling to understand what they'd missed about human combat capabilities. What they'd missed, it turned out, was quite a lot. Humans weren't actually fragile. They were durable in ways that galactic biology had failed to recognize. Their skeletal structure could handle incredible stress through flexibility. Their muscle attachments were optimized for explosive power rather than sustained strength. Their nervous system could override pain signals during crisis situations, allowing them to function through injuries that would incapacitate species with more sensitive biological feedback systems. More importantly, humans were persistence predators. Their entire evolutionary history had been built around the principle of relentless, patient pursuit. They didn't need to be the fastest or the strongest. They just needed to be stubborn enough to keep going long after their prey had exhausted itself. That same principle applied to learning combat techniques. Elena hadn't been struggling during those first 4 weeks. She'd been studying. Every time Kovacs had knocked her down, she'd learned something about his attack patterns. Every demonstration where he'd broken her guard, she'd analyzed the mechanics. Every mocking comment about human weakness had reinforced her focus on finding the vulnerabilities in Vrexian technique. She'd spent 4 weeks being the cohort's punching bag, while quietly becoming an expert in exactly where and how to hurt them. The new combat instructor assigned to replace Kovacs was a Kolthari named Grevtor, who'd spent 60 cycles studying comparative xenobiology. Their first session with the cohort had been remarkably direct. For 4,000 cycles, Grevtor had said, their rocky voice resonating through the training floor. This academy has operated under certain assumptions about species capability rankings. We are now revising those assumptions. The human strike force to body mass ratio exceeds projections by roughly 400%. Their capacity to absorb and process tactical information while under physical stress has been severely underestimated. Their pain tolerance is frankly alarming from a medical perspective. I am told the previous instructor learned these facts the hard way. Grevtor had paused, crystalline eyes scanning the cohort. Does anyone else need a practical demonstration, or can we proceed with actual training? The cohort had chosen actual training. Elena's hand had healed within 2 weeks, aided by the station's medical technology. Kovacs's jaw had taken the projected 8 weeks, and when he'd returned to the station, he'd been reassigned to administrative duties. The official reason was medical leave extending into retirement considerations. The unofficial reason was that watching him flinch every time a human walked past was undermining confidence in Vrexian combat superiority. The Academy's policy on human recruits had been revised extensively. They were no longer considered trial admissions. 3 more humans had arrived by the end of Elena's rotation. They'd been assigned to regular training cohorts with instructors who'd been thoroughly briefed on not making the same mistakes as Kovacs. Elena herself had graduated with high marks and a job offer from the Collective Security Force. She'd politely declined, explaining that she'd promised her mother she'd come home after the training rotation. The Academy's commandant had asked if she'd at least consider serving as a human combat consultant. She'd said she'd think about it. On her last day at Station Helix 9, she'd stopped by the medical bay to see Krovax. He'd been cleared for solid foods by then, though his jaw still ached in cold environments. He'd looked up as she entered, and something complicated had passed across his face. "I wanted to apologize," Elena had said. "I didn't intend to cause permanent injury." Krovax had worked his jaw carefully before responding. "You did exactly what I trained you to do. You identified your opponent's weakness and exploited it with maximum efficiency. That I was too arrogant to recognize I'd created my own defeat is not your fault. Still, I'm sorry. Don't be." He'd managed something that might have been a smile on a species with different facial structures. "I learned more from that single strike than from 60 cycles of teaching. It was an expensive lesson, but perhaps necessary." Elena had nodded. "For what it's worth, you're an excellent instructor. Just maybe try insulting the students less." "I shall take that under advisement." She'd left the station on the same transport that had brought her, carrying the same small bag, looking exactly as unremarkable as she had when she'd arrived. The difference was that now every member of the Academy watched her walk past with respect that bordered on cautious fear. The Galactic Collective would eventually update its official documentation on human combat capabilities. The process would take approximately 3 cycles, because bureaucracy moved at its own pace regardless of jaw-shattering revelations. The new assessment would note that humans possessed unexpected strike efficiency and notable capacity for tactical patience, and should be considered viable candidates for combat, specialization pending further study. What the documentation would fail to capture was the lesson that Krovax had learned the hard way, that was now being taught to every instructor at every collective military facility. Assumptions were dangerous things, especially when they concerned soft-looking primates who smiled too much and kept getting back up. The Galactic Collective had spent 14,000 cycles being comfortable with its opinions. Turned out they'd been wrong about a great many things. One broken jaw at a time, they were learning to reconsider. Somewhere on a planet called Earth, in a country that experienced sunlight for 3 months of the year and darkness for the rest, Elena Koskinen returned to her normal life. She went back to work. She visited her mother. She met friends for coffee and told highly edited versions of her time in space that left out the part where she'd hospitalized an 8-foot alien with a single punch. When asked if she'd go back, she'd smiled and said maybe. When asked if she'd recommend the experience to other humans, she'd said it had been educational. And on Station Helix 9, in an office overlooking the training complex, a report was filed recommending that humans be reclassified from unsuitable for combat roles to approach with appropriate caution. The universe had gotten a little bit smaller. Humanity had gotten a lot more interesting. And somewhere in the medical bay, a Vrexian combat master touched his jaw and wondered if perhaps he'd been teaching the wrong lessons all along. The thing about empires that span galaxies is that they develop opinions. The trick is surviving long enough to prove those opinions wrong. Humanity was still new to the collective, still figuring out where they fit in a universe full of species that were faster, stronger, more durable, and more dangerous than they'd ever be. But they were learning. And more importantly, they were teaching everyone else a valuable lesson about the difference between looking weak and actually being weak. It was a lesson that generally involved someone getting punched in the face. Human diplomacy was going to be very interesting.